Welcome to the Growing Tall Poppies podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nat Green, and I'm so excited to have you join me as we discuss what it means to navigate your way through post-traumatic growth and not just survive, but to thrive after trauma. Through our podcast, we will explore ways for you to create a life filled with greater purpose, self-awareness, and a deep inner peace. Through integrating the many years of knowledge and professional experience, as well as the wisdom of those who have experienced trauma firsthand, we will combine psychology, accelerated approaches, coaching, and personal experience to assist you to learn, to grow, and to thrive. I hope to empower you to create deeper awareness and understanding and stronger connections with yourself and with others, whilst also paving the way for those who have experienced trauma and adversity to reduce their suffering and become the very best versions of themselves in order to thrive. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. I'm really excited today to bring you our next guest on the Growing Tall Poppies podcast. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome a wonderful lady. Let me introduce you to Dr. Irena O'Brien, who is a cognitive neuroscientist with 3 decades of experience studying psychology and neuroscience. After an initial career as a chartered accountant, she transitioned to neuroscience, earning her PhD in psychology, and I'm going to test my French here, from the Université de Quebec à Montreal. Her research involved brain imaging and electrophysiological studies, and she further expanded her expertise through a postdoctoral fellowship at McGill University's Centre for Language, Mind and Brain. Dr. Irena founded the Neuroscience School, a program aimed at providing coaches and health professionals with practical, evidence-based neuroscience tools. She is extremely committed to addressing misinformation by simplifying complex neuroscientific concepts for wider accessibility. She is particularly passionate about how lifestyle choices affect brain health, mood, and cognitive function, especially as we age. And additionally, I'm very excited to share that her Neuroscience of Coaching podcast now ranks amongst the top 10% of podcasts worldwide. So she's doing amazing things, and this really reflects her impact and her reach in this field. So with no further ado, welcome, Irena. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me, Nat. Should I call you Nat or Dr. Nat?
Nat is fine. And I know we talked a little while ago and you're happy for me to call you Irena rather than our doctor.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm still shocked when people call me doctor. It hasn't sunk in.
No, it still feels weird, isn't it? It's like I'm still the person I was. It's a title.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I love that. And I love when we chatted recently on your amazing podcast, how it was just lovely to connect and chat about things. And I know today you're going to be sharing some amazing things about the brain and bits about your research. And then our listeners will be able to relate it to trauma and how it will affect them in what they're going through. So I might get you to just start with a brief introduction of what you do in the world now around your neuroscience school.
So in my school, I teach coaches and helping professionals about the neuroscience of change. So we cover a wide range of topics, from willpower and motivation to focus and decision-making, emotion, stress, and then diet, exercise, and sleep. That is my passion, is about the diet, exercise, and sleep and how it affects the brain. Yeah.
It's such a fascinating area, isn't it? And there really is so much that we don't know. We know so little about the brain.
That is true, but we do know more and more. And especially when it comes to diet, exercise, and sleep, it's such a growing area of research right now. Finally, scientists have jumped onto that bandwagon that we're a mind-body system, and that in order to have a healthy brain, you have to have a healthy body.
Definitely. So, what do you think the biggest link is there that they hadn't been seeing?
I think they saw us as the brain being separate from the body, and that the brain was actually more important than the body, which is not true. The purpose of the brain is to make sure that we grow, survive, and reproduce. It's not about thinking, it's not about emotion, it's not about making the right decisions. It's really in service, the brain is in service of the body. And so the brain receives information, right, from the body, which is called interoceptive sensations, and sensations from outside the body, or exteroceptive sensations. And it runs through the brain, and the brain decides what to do with it based on past experience. So it decides what it means. So in the case of trauma, for example, we can just go right into trauma. So I'm not an expert in trauma, but I know generally how the brain works. So something happens, you have some sensation, either in interoceptive, exteroceptive, right, from inside the body or outside the body. And that information is sent up to the brain, and it happens so quickly that you don't even notice. Like your heart will start beating faster. You don't notice that, but your heart does. It sends that
Mm.
information to the brain, and then the brain decides what that means. And the brain is built from past experience. So your brain is built from even before you were born, from the womb. And that's how your brain is built. So, in effect, your brain really reflects all of your past experiences.
It really is so fascinating, isn't it? So, past experiences from the time we're in the womb are all in there, held within that brain, every single thing.
Every single thing.
Wow. And then I know you talk a lot about the predictive brain. So I'd love for you to introduce that if now's the right time, because we know that everything, all our experiences are held within our brain.
Yeah, all our past experiences, that's how our brain is built. And so let's say the brain takes all that information that I just talked about that it receives from the body and from the outside world. And yeah, so it runs it through what it knows, like its own model of the world, because it's created, right? Your brain has created a model of the world for you. It runs it through that and then issues the response. So with the predictive brain, it not just issues a response, it anticipates the response. So it makes a guess based on past experience. So in effect, your brain will ask something like, the last time that I was in this situation or a similar situation as this one today, what did I do then? And if you're
Mm.
alive today, your brain will say, oh, so I'll issue the same response again because I've kept you alive. So I must be doing something right. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the key, isn't it? Our
Isn't it?
brain is working to keep us alive, and it's using all our past experiences to help us know what to do next and how we
Yes.
respond or react. So it makes
Yes.
total sense. And I love how you put it in such easy to understand terms, because really, when in the past, when I've tried to learn about neuroscience and study the brain, it feels like there's so much. And my brain has struggled to keep all the information in there. So I really love how you've just said, no, this is what it is. You take all the things from inside us, all the signals from outside us, and then we make it make sense based on our own experiences. Would that be a correct
Yep.
understanding?
Exactly. And that's how trauma is perpetuated. because it's always making the same predictions. And predictions are not bad. Predictions are what enable us to play sports, right? Because we have to make fast responses. And if we waited until the brain had all the information and took its time to make a decision about what to do next, you'd never hit a tennis ball because it would go right by you.
That's me playing tennis, Irena.
Yeah, and not just that, it also keeps us alive. So going for a walk in the woods and you think you might see a bear, but you're not sure, right? It just looks, there's some kind of brown figure maybe behind a tree. You don't want your brain to start arguing with itself and thinking, is it a bear? Is it not a bear? Maybe I'll wait a little longer until I'm absolutely sure. No, your brain's going to tell you to get out of there. So it's predicting that's a bear. So evolutionarily, it's kept us alive.
Yes. So the brain uses past experiences to predict future emotions and responses.
Yes.
What happens when our brain's predictions are inaccurate?
We can change them. We can change them after the fact, right? So what I mean by that, so if that response is inappropriate, there are a couple of things you can do to slow down. There's one thing you can do to slow down the prediction. So when the information comes into the brain through the thalamus, it's sent to the amygdala, and the amygdala is mostly processes emotion, especially fear and anxiety.
Yes.
So that's like the trauma center, right, of the brain. But it also sends the information to the prefrontal cortex, but it takes longer to get to the prefrontal cortex. And so if you wait that 10 seconds or so, or I say counting to 10, then your prefrontal cortex can kick in and decide that, no, this is not a dangerous situation. And then it can change that prediction. So that's one way to do it. But I know in trauma, it happens so fast and that's really difficult to do sometimes. Actually, often it's difficult to do. So in theory, and I'm not saying it's easy, in theory, you can change it after the fact. It's issued its prediction, right? And so it causes this big emotional reaction. But you can evaluate that emotional reaction, right? And look at it and say, in this situation, every time I have this combination of bodily responses and external responses, does it always mean that? Right? And so you can change it. And then eventually you will start changing the brain's predictions going forward because you are changing the brain whenever you do that. And I realize it is not easy to do in trauma. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I think, though, that we know it's not easy. One of the biggest things, particularly for my audience with trauma, is that we want to know that it's possible. And that gives hope.
It is possible, right? Because the brain is plastic. So plastic means that it can rewire itself. It rewires itself with effort, right? A goal and effort, but it is possible. So in theory, everyone can rewire their brains. And if you have difficulty with the trauma, that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you.
Yes, definitely. And it's around starting to get that understanding of the predictive brain may not always be correct. It may be coming from it is coming from past experiences. So if we can work out ways to cue that so it makes a different choice, that's part of that changing the brain and that neuroplasticity.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And another thing too is also about what can help somewhat is accepting the way things are. Or have another way to put it is to have compassion for yourself.
That's a big one, isn't it? Because I know
But
it's not something that comes naturally. We tend to be more critical of ourselves rather than compassionate, don't we?
yes, but it's one of the biggest gifts you can give yourself is to be
Abs-
compassionate. And it can
Definitely.
take a long time. So I've had anxiety and I still suffer from anxiety. But so I've had anxiety for a long time, and I've been through therapy, lots of years of therapy and coaching, and I always hoped that the anxiety would go away. And then I'd also had a coach who kept encouraging me to accept the anxiety.
Mm.
It took me like 10 years to finally accept that, okay, so this is the way things are. And you know what? Surprisingly, I felt calmer. The anxiety was not so
Wow.
potent anymore. Doesn't mean I don't have it, but it wasn't so potent. And the research shows that when you accept circumstances, that it reduces the amygdala activation. So your amygdala activation is reduced. And yeah, even the subjective feeling is reduced.
That's fascinating. So I'm just going to ask if we can unpack that a little, just around that anxiety. What was it that changed that? Was it almost like obviously you'd been working for 10 years on it, but you made a
Yeah.
choice to accept it. What was it that got you there?
I always thought that, and when I've said that to people, they say that's giving up, right, on change, but it's not giving up. It was just, I'm not sure. I guess like I'd read the literature and I knew that it was really beneficial to do it. And then one day I did, but I'd been thinking about it for 10 years.
So you definitely had the seeds were planted and you were already on your path, but it sounds like you couldn't do that until you were ready. And one day you made a decision,
Yeah.
you were ready, and you did get that benefit of accepting making a difference. I
And then
love
I
that.
can work on the anxiety. I can apply strategies without being so triggered as I was before. So it gave me some freedom.
Yeah, I love that. I love that so much. When, you've talked a little bit about neuroplasticity. So, what role does neuroplasticity play in reshaping emotional responses just like that? How would you say, from a neuroscience perspective, that came about?
So it's your brain that issues the response. Like people talk about the heart brain and that's the emotional center. It's not. The heart only does heart things, but it sends the information to the brain and the brain decides what to do with it. It's not the heart that decides because the heart doesn't have any connections to the outside world, right? But the brain does. And so the brain decides what to do with it. So it's all about changing your predictive brain. It's really the only way to change an emotional reaction. You can do it consciously after the fact, right? You can start thinking about, oh, really? Did that make sense? Was that the best response? Maybe in such similar situations, I can start to respond in a different way. And then that's a new learning for the brain. And the more you do that, the more it will become your new model of the world going forward. I'm not saying that's easy.
I,
And I don't want to minimize trauma at all. It can be very difficult. And I think with trauma, it's super difficult because the response is so instinctual and so dramatic.
and can be so intense. And
Yeah.
because we're in that fight or flight mode so often and on
Or
edge,
freeze, or
yeah, or
freeze.
freeze or
And
fawn.
now they even or fawn. Yeah.
Yeah. So because of that, it can influence and change that predictive brain. But as you've just shared, we are able to do it. We're able to start to train it. And I love that you can then get to that point of just making a decision to accept, accepting that this is the way it is and seeing what happens. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You try something else.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it can be hard to accept the reactions, right? The trauma reactions, because they just happen so quickly. And as you said, they're so intense. But you're doing, if you can do that, then you're giving yourself like a huge gift.
Yeah, definitely. So you said that you really love working around the mind body side of things and really focusing on healthy and how we influence that with what we eat. So, what lifestyle factors have the biggest impact on brain health and emotional regulation from your perspective?
All three of those: diet, exercise, and sleep. Sleep is super important, right? Getting a good night's sleep. So after a night of short sleep, the following day, you're easier to anger. Your negative emotional reactions are going to be stronger. So getting a good night's sleep, and then there are also brain benefits, right? So not getting enough sleep has really negative brain effects. It's been shown that most psychological disorders or mental health disorders also have comorbid sleep disorders. And so that's a chicken and egg question,
Yeah.
which came first? Which came first? That's not known, but it is known that sleep will help with all kinds of emotional reactions, and it will help with overall brain health. Because if you're not sleeping enough, you're actually damaging your brain, like physically damaging your brain. So sleep is hugely important. Exercise is more and more now is being seen as a number one treatment for depression.
And what sort of exercise, assuming you're not telling us we need to go and run a marathon, what sort of exercise is beneficial to get someone started if they're in that anxiety, depression, trauma response? Where could they start?
Anything that you can do. So you've all heard about the 10,000 steps a day.
Yeah.
That was a marketing thing that came out of Japan. I'm not sure when, in the 1940s, perhaps.
Okay.
And so it's not 10,000 steps a day, but the research has shown that even something like 2,500 steps a day is beneficial. So start where you are. And then, of course, 10,000 steps is better than 2,500, but don't minimize the 2,500. You could do 2,500 steps, in 15 minutes, I think. 10,000 takes an hour. So you can do 2,500 steps in 15 minutes. So go out for a walk every day, and preferably in nature if you can. Or I'm fortunate to live in Montreal. I live in the city, but Montreal loves its trees.
Oh,
And
that's good.
all the streets are tree lined, except for when you're really downtown. But all those streets are tree lined. And so it's very green here in the summer, not in the winter, but it's very green. So it is pleasant to take a walk. And so being in nature is beneficial also, in addition to the exercise part of it, because nature is calming.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely.
Yeah. So start where you are, and if you don't exercise at all, start going for 15-minute walks and see how you feel, and try to get some nature in that 15-minute walk.
And what about what we eat?
Diet too is hugely important. So I am a fan of the paleo diet. Do you know the paleo diet? Yeah, and I border on keto too.
Yeah, I like keto personally. I'm a keto fan.
Yeah, so I border on keto, but I don't always succeed because I do like potatoes.
Yes.
But carbs, diet high in carbs is really bad for the brain. And that's because of the high glucose and the high insulin. I just read a study about how, I can't remember exactly what it said, but scientists now call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a high sugar, high carb diet is known to be really bad for the brain. Yeah. And so if something is bad for the brain, you're not going to be at your best. And so I know me, if I have a carb fix, if I eat a big bag of chips at night, that happens sometimes. The following day, I actually feel depressed. I feel lethargic and depressed the next day.
I can relate to that because, if I make that choice, and it really is a choice, isn't it? But I want it now. The next day, I'm the same. I'm quite sluggish. I think, why did I do that? So it definitely changes our capacity for doing things and thinking in the same way.
And it makes the trauma feel worse because we're feeling awful. So it's making everything feel worse. And then it also saps our energy. So you don't have the energy to deal with the trauma.
And I would imagine that it impacts that predictive brain that you've talked about, because then it goes back to thinking or experiencing a time where you also felt like that. So it keeps you stuck down in that anxiety, depression, or trauma response.
Yeah. And there's also a reason why you had that bag of chips that night, right? You're probably self-medicating in a certain way. And that was your predictive brain in action.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is absolutely fascinating. And I know that I introduced you, that you said that you actually had a background in accounting. And I
Yes.
do think, wow, accounting to neuroscience. What on earth inspired you to transition from accounting to neuroscience, Irena?
I was a tax accountant, actually, which actually, as far as accounting goes, which was a lot more fun than just accounting, but tax accounting is all about reading the law and investigating what does it mean. And in the research that I did, it's exactly the same thing. It's similar, right? It's about getting to the truth,
Mm,
right?
yeah,
So I think I'm just a researcher at heart. Like I don't do any academic research anymore, but I have my news feed of that I look at every day to see what's new in neuroscience, like what came out, what research came out in neuroscience and psychology. And then I write about it and I have my podcast about it.
yeah, and
Yeah,
definitely that keeps your brain neuroplastic and keeps you learning new things and growing, doesn't it, really?
yeah, yeah. But I also try and eat the healthy diet. I do. I'm pretty good at minimizing my carbs. You don't have to go to zero,
No.
or you don't have to be extreme about it. But food is readily available now. And it's also important to fast between meals, right? To empty the stomach between meals. That doesn't mean you have to go like for this intermittent fasting that people talk about, where you only eat for a 6 hour window and then you fast
Mm.
for the other 18 hours. You can have your 3 meals a day, but don't eat between meals either. And it's important for your brain, for your insulin levels, for your body to fast between meals.
And again, you're talking about optimizing brain health as much as possible. So these are
Exactly.
fascinating tips. They're fantastic tips for people who are looking to feel better overall, but particularly if you've experienced trauma. These might be things that you can try or speak to your doctor about, trying to double check that it's okay and it's safe for you. So, what about neuroscience? It's a fascinating field, as I've said. Would you say are some common neuroscience myths or misunderstandings that you'd like to debunk?
That we only use 10% of our brain. That's absolutely not true. We use all of our brain all the time. And this 10% of our brain really, it just blames people for their own, I'm not going to use the word disorders, but for their own struggles. And
Yeah.
that's not true. We use all of our brains all the time. What's another one? I can't think of one right now. Can you think of any? Yeah.
I think that's a really good one, because how often do we hear that? It's like, oh, you only use 10% of your brain. Not, one thing that does fascinate me is around, and I don't know that it's a myth, is around that prefrontal cortex, and the brain doesn't develop fully until the age of 25. I'm not saying that's a myth. I'd love you to talk about that.
I'm not sure of the exact age, but it is in the early 20s, actually. And so that's why you see that young people are often impulsive. They can make poor decisions that we can see objectively as being poor. I know my son, when he got his car, he was very late teens. He was about 20, and the car accidents that he would get into, but it wasn't car accidents with other cars. He ended up in a pothole, like a deep pothole one time in a parking lot.
Oh dear.
And yeah, it really damaged his car. Another time he was driving down a hill and he was too fast and he hit the curb with his wheel driving down fast. So he damaged his wheel. So it was things like that. And we were thinking like, where's your brain?
And it's funny, isn't it? Not funny, but that's the reality that when we have our more mature brain, we can see that. We can see
Yeah.
objectively the things that are going on, but it's really important as a parent that we understand that. I think that they're not deliberately doing that. That part of the brain hasn't actually developed yet.
Yeah. And you find, especially young men, right at that
Yes.
age, they feel invincible. Do you see that? Have you
Oh, yes. I
experienced
have a young man in he's 22, 23 this year, and I see that happening with him and his friends, and you just think, you're nearly there. You're nearly there at 20 to 25 age.
I have a friend who's a restaurant owner, and she has a lot of young people who serve in her restaurant, young people like in their early 20s, late
Hmm.
teens, early 20s. And she affectionately says that they're dumb, like they're just stupid at that age. And she doesn't mean it. It's a term of endearment that she's
Yes, of
using.
course. So, what would you say has been the most surprising discovery in your research on the brain and emotions?
The most surprising thing is that we construct our emotions.
Mm.
That we construct all of our emotional responses from the information that we get from our bodily sensations and from the external sensations, right? And that's sent up to the brain, and then the brain decides the emotional response. So it's the brain that always decides. Even though it feels like it's coming from our body, it's not. It's the brain that decides. Yeah. So the brain decides. Oh, one of the surprising things too, not just about emotion, but just about even touch, for example, is a brain response.
Tell me a bit more
And
about that.
yeah, even touch is a brain response. And that became really clear. So I was a student gave an example of how during the pandemic, they tried to get her mother to use an iPad so that she could Zoom with her grandchildren
Mm.
and her children. But her mom suffered from neuropathy, which is like no
Ah,
feeling in memory.
yeah.
And so she couldn't even, like when she tapped, so she could physically tap whatever she wanted, but it didn't register in the brain
Ah,
because of
because
her neuropathy. Yeah,
yeah,
so
so the
physically
nerve.
she was touching the keys,
Ah,
but it didn't register in the brain. So so even touch is brain derived.
that's fascinating and makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking, my dad has peripheral neuropathy in his feet.
Yeah,
So even as he's walking along, the messages he's getting to his brain are going to be different, aren't they?
they're going to be different. Yeah,
That's
some people with neuropathy could take their limbs through something that would cause us tremendous pain, and for them, it doesn't because it doesn't register in the brain. Yeah.
wow. Oh, we could talk all day. There really is so much information now available to us that just wasn't around when we started in our careers. You look at the changes over the last 30 years, they're huge. And we're really living in an exciting time that there's so much change and things evolving. I can't even begin to imagine how it's going to be in another 30 years as we learn more and
Oh,
more.
yeah. Yeah, it's going to be amazing. Another thing about trauma too is that you feel it in the body, right? You feel the
Mm.
emotion in the body. Basil van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, and then there are
Yes,
some other, yeah, and there are others. And it is true, but all you're feeling, so the body keeps the sensation. The brain
yes,
decides what emotion it is. But that sensation in trauma is so strong. And because of your predictive brain, it always issues the same response.
exactly.
Yeah.
Mm.
And if that sensation was less strong, then
Hmm.
the brain might issue a different response. But how do you lessen the sensation? I
Great
don't know.
question.
Yeah. How do you lessen the sensation?
That's a really great question. And I guess that's where that somatic work and the nervous system work really comes in.
Yeah.
The training that I'm doing at the moment, and we talked about this, is this TRE, so trauma and tension release exercises, which is about working out where that trauma or emotional response is stored in our brain and finding a safe, gentle way to release that through, well, in the process that I use, in tremoring. So starting to gradually release that from our body may work, just as you've talked about, in reducing that emotional response and that intensity so that we change our overall response to trauma that way.
Because it always starts from the body. It starts from the bodily sensations.
Yes,
So if you can reduce it, then your brain is going to predict differently. So do you find that's helpful to
very, very helpful in just having an overall calming effect. And the more you practice it, it's like different, it's like an onion. The more layers peel away. And for some people that do it, they might be get this flood of intense emotion. So you should never try it on your own if you've got severe, intense PTSD. For example, it's something that once you're no longer in that intense phase, that you can do it gently. And it's something you can do for 10 minutes a day or 10 minutes a few times a week. And it just gently peels away the layers and gives you that sense of being able to regulate your nervous system and your emotional response in a more controlled way.
yeah, and then you're changing your predictive brain patterns when you're doing that too, if you do that on a regular basis. And then if you're reducing that sensation, I'm not going to call it an emotion because the brain decides it's an emotion, but the bodily sensation that comes up first.
Yes, definitely. And then it makes a decision of what it's going to interpret it as.
Yeah, and so if that bodily sensation is less intense, then it will interpret it differently.
And
Brain
then,
will interpret it differently.
yes, which again flows into that neuroplasticity, reshaping emotional responses after trauma, doesn't it?
Yes.
So I want to really just spend a little bit of time as we finish up about your neuroscience school. So, how can coaches and therapists apply neuroscience to help clients manage their emotions more effectively?
Wow. So we do have, my program is a 14 module program. So we do go through all of this. Yeah. So we do go through things like what I said, willpower, motivation. Oh, we take a deeper look at neuroplasticity. We look at focus and decision making, stress. We look at stress. So there's a module on stress. There's a module on emotion. There's a module on resilience. What else is there? Diet, exercise, sleep, and relationships. We also do that too.
Great.
So there are, even though I don't specifically address trauma in
Mm-hmm.
the program, because that's a specialized field
Yeah.
and I don't have that expertise, there are tools and strategies that you can learn to help. For example, with my anxiety, there are tools and strategies that I've learned that help with that. So acceptance and compassion is one. And so I tell them often, the students often, that it's a gift to yourself to and to your clients. And it also helps with when you have compassion, when you can help your client with self-compassion, it because it's hard, or I would even say it's impossible to change if you're still beating yourself up
Yes.
over stuff,
Abs-
right? You have to
mm.
calm down the nervous system before you can start to change. So you could do techniques like breathing, right, to calm down heart rate variability, to calm down the nervous system, compassion, to calm down the nervous system, and then you can start to make changes. But there are other strategies. I built my business, even though I was in a high anxious state, and I would wake up in the morning with a sense of despair. I, I don't wake up with a sense of despair anymore, but I did for a long time. And so I learned a strategy to start my day. I'm just talking about start my work day, right? I go to my office in my home and I sit in front of the computer and I didn't want to do anything because I felt so awful. And so the strategy is start with something small and simple that you can achieve. And the theory behind that is once you achieve that, but so small and simple, something that's still important to do for your business or for your work. And once you achieve that, you get a spike in dopamine. So you feel great after you've done that. And that spike in dopamine predicts your success on the next task. So you can organize your day as a series of small tasks so you keep getting that dopamine hit all day long. I've heard someone call it a dopamine drip.
Oh, I like that.
And it absolutely worked. It works to start with a small, achievable task the first thing in the morning. And I was always amazed about how that would create a productive day for me.
What a fabulous tip. And I think we can all benefit from that, trauma or no trauma. That's something, life is full of ups and downs. As part of being human, it's going to have ups and downs. So those are really exciting tips to know that we can just do one little thing and set our day up differently.
I teach that to all my students, that one trick and how it can set them up for a productive day. And yeah, they've all seen it, how it does create a productive day. So this starting with the hardest thing first, that never worked for me because I would sit there
Oh,
and just not want to start because
oh,
I felt so much in despair.
I thought you were going to say start with the hardest thing first. And my head went, oh, no, I don't like that. I always procrastinate on that one. That's good.
Yeah, that's what happens. So if I'm sitting down to write an article, writing an article is hard. And from, let's say, explaining a research study, so I'll take something easy. Like I used to be the kind that I like to start with the first word of the first sentence and write it that way, but that's not the way articles are written. So I'll do something easy, like just cut and paste the method section into my document and start to work on that, on simplifying that. And then, that later on in the day or the next day, I might add more. And the other thing too is that now I write over 4 or 5 days rather than trying to put it out all in one shot so I can think about it, make edits.
So chunking it down into small
And
bite-sized chunks.
the whole thing is it has to be achievable. Like the chunk that you chunk it down to has to be achievable. So you have a feeling of success.
Yes. And get that dopamine drip happening. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know that your neuroscience school has a new intake coming up. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because I'm sure there'd be a number of our listeners who think this is really fascinating. I'm really interested in finding out about Dr. Irena's neuroscience school.
Yeah, we have an intake coming up really soon. I have a webinar on April 15th, and I have two times at 12 noon and at 6 p.m. Montreal time. So the 6 p.m. time should be doable for people in Australia.
Yes, that'd be
Yeah, 6
perfect
p.m.
time.
time. And the webinar is about cognitive flexibility. So I have the webinar, and that's when the cart opens. We start on April 28th. And this intake is an accelerated program. So rather than doing it over 16 weeks, we do it over 8 weeks. So it's at double the speed.
Oh, that sounds great. So I'll put that in the show notes, definitely, the link to that. So, where can our listeners find out more about you and find you online?
Neuroscienceschool.com.
That's easy.
They can find me.
Neuroscienceschool.com.
Yeah,
Excellent.
yeah. And yeah, the webinar, I'm going to post it. I'm going to put like a banner on the site for the webinar.
Excellent. So, we'll put the link in the show notes and everyone can head on over and check it out. I'm very keen to to look at it. I might even sign up, I think, for this round.
Oh, it'd be lovely to have you join us. Yeah.
I'm most interested. I find neuroscience fascinating. As I said, it's such a huge field, and you make it make so much sense.
That seems to be my secret sauce. I've been told that I simplify it, I make it understandable.
I love that so much. So is there any other great words of wisdom you'd like to leave our listeners with before we finish up?
The most important things that you can do for a healthy brain is diet, exercise, and sleep. If you do those things, you're going to feel better. And I'm not saying that it will, but your trauma symptoms might reduce a bit. In any event, it's good for the brain and it's good for healthy aging.
And let's face it, we want to age healthily, don't we?
Yeah, we do. We do. And as far as trauma specific, I empathize. I know it's difficult and the reactions come, our predictive brain issues those reactions before we even realize what's happening.
Yeah, and I think that's key, isn't it? That it doesn't happen really slowly and we get time to think about it and process it. It's bang, it's a response and it's there and it's, oh, where did that come from?
Yeah, it goes from 0 to 100 in no time.
Yeah. But I'm so grateful because you've shared some amazing tips and strategies that I know our listeners are going to be like, oh my goodness, that's wonderful, and be testing things out, even if they just sitting there getting that one dopamine hit of a morning to start their day, and they're taking their 2,500 steps. Just one little thing to make a difference.
That starting small is super important, because if we bite off too big a goal, it'll stop us in our tracks, right? It's scary, but we can always start with something small. If you can't do 2,500 steps in a day, just go for a 5-minute walk. Just take a walk around the block. Like, start somewhere. And it's never too late. That's the other thing. People think it's too late. Sometimes it can be too late. But the research shows that that even a senior's 80 years old can start exercise programs, and they get physical and cognitive benefits from it. It's never too late. Just start.
Exactly. Make a decision to start. Small things. What's that saying? I always botch up sayings. I think it's, how do we eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Exactly. That things can feel really big, particularly when our body is sending messages, our brain's interpreting, our brain's predicting it. Things can feel so overwhelming, but we can just choose one thing, one tiny little thing, and make a start. So it's possible for all of us. And I thank you so much for coming on. I think you've given us so much hope that we can change our brain and we can mold it to create a different future for ourselves. So thank you so much, Irena. It's been wonderful having you on.
Thank you so much, Nat, for inviting me. It's
Thank
been
you.
wonderful.
Great. Bye for now.
Okay, bye.
Thank you for joining me in this episode of Growing Tall Poppies. It is my deepest hope that today's episode may have inspired and empowered you to step fully into your post-traumatic growth so that you can have absolute clarity around who you are, what matters the most to you, and to assist you to release your negative emotions and regulate your nervous system so you can fully thrive. New episodes are published every Tuesday, and I hope you'll continue to join us as we explore both the strategies and the personal qualities required to fully live a life of post-traumatic growth and to thrive. So if it feels aligned to you and really resonates, then I invite you to hit subscribe, and it would mean the world to us if you could share this episode with others who you feel may benefit too. You may also find me on Instagram at Growing Tall Poppies and Facebook, Dr. Natalie Green. Remember, every moment is an opportunity to look for the lessons and to learn and increase your ability to live the life you desire and deserve. So for now, stay connected, stay inspired, stand tall like the tall poppy you are, and keep shining your light brightly in the world. Bye for now.